All right. Hi, everybody. Today we're here to talk about accounts payable invoice automation using the Coderis platform. And one of the things I want to make sure that we get across is, there are a lot of solutions out there that are talking about their ability to automate your accounts payable process, to receive in vendor invoices and push them through to your ERP to seamlessly process those transactions. Really, and I'll try to highlight these as we go through it. We're trying to take a different approach to that. We're using some innovative new tools and capabilities or modern technology, especially leveraging our Coderis power tooling and the AWS platform. But we're also doing what I call pre-processing, which is really understanding and analyzing the data, matching, but then trying to apply some rules in advance of processing or posting them to your ERP to provide a cleaner, more accurate automation process. So I'm going to take a few minutes here and walk through some slides, and then we'll jump into a live demonstration of the capabilities. But this is really the process or the workflow to get set up to start using Coderis AP invoice automation. The first thing that we do is we're going to determine how are we going to be getting the invoices from the vendor and delivering those to the Coderis platform. And so there's a number of different ways that we can do this. We can certainly take a document and we can manually load that document, upload or load that document into the Coderis platform. So that's an option. I think the preferred methodology, what we're seeing implemented really across the board with our customers, is to define a dedicated inbox in your email system for your vendors to send those invoice documents. So it may be something like apinvoices@coderis.com or at yourcompany.com. So it's a dedicated email inbox. Your vendors will send their invoices to that inbox. And then what we'll do is we'll set up a rule leveraging your email technology to create a copy of that email, not just the document itself, but the entire email, and send that to Coderis. So again, first step in this process, how are we going to get those invoices from the vendor over to the Coderis platform? And again, multiple methodologies to implement that. The most popular by far that we see is leveraging email, copy or clone and forward. And now we've got the invoice in Coderis. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to read the email and we're going to read any documents or attachments associated with that email, leveraging a combination of tool sets. So we are using some AWS tooling called Textract. Textract leverages artificial intelligence to read documents and extract the data and then allow that data to be used in other ways. We combine that with some Coderis tooling, what we call our power tooling, where we can create additional rules or mapping above and beyond the AWS Textract artificial intelligence tooling. And that tooling, by the way, that the Coderis power tooling is something that's been developed over the last 10 years. It's used heavily in other areas of our platform, specifically by a number of customers for sales order automation. So we're taking advantage of multiple tool sets to now understand not only the email, but the document or documents attached to that email, read those documents and extract the data so that it can be used through this automation process. So once we've used that tooling, and by the way, I want to just mention the success that we've seen using this combination of tooling in this step in the process. We're seeing anywhere from 80 to 90% accuracy, just leveraging the tooling through in the first pass of reading those documents. And what I mean by that is we're not having to go into each individual vendor document and fingerprint or map that document. We're not having to tell the system where to look for the purchase order or the invoice number. We're not having to tell the system where to look for the products, the quantity, the costs at the line level. The tooling is reading 80 to 90% of that without us touching it. So what that does is it dramatically reduces the implementation time and costs. It drives a faster time to value and allows us to focus on those areas maybe that are not typical, or where a vendor has a different methodology for delivering information via the AP invoices. So at that point, we've now mapped the data. We've captured the data in Coderis. It's not yet to your ERP, but we've basically created an electronic version of that vendor invoice. And we can now become that pre-processing engine to understand the data, to start to do the mapping against the transactional data in your ERP. One of the things I want to mention at this point is in the Coderis platform, we're actually bringing over a number of pieces of data, a number of transaction sets. So we're bringing over vendors, we're bringing over purchase orders, we're bringing over the products, we're bringing over the vendor contracts. So we've mirrored that, or brought that data over into Coderis, and that allows us to start to do matching even prior to posting the AP invoice, the electronic file, to your ERP for AP processing. So we've received the email, we've analyzed the document, we've extracted the data to create an invoice inside of an AP invoice inside of Coderis. And we're now going to start to match that to one or more purchase order or purchase order receipts, again, in advance of posting it to the ERP. So how are we doing that matching? We're leveraging a number of different rules. The first thing we're going to do is, if we can identify a purchase order number or purchase order numbers from the vendor invoice, we're going to look to see if we can match those against PO transactions inside of Coderis. And if we get a hit there, that's the first step in the process. We're then going to look to try to match totals on that vendor invoice against POs. So we're going to look at subtotals on the invoice. We're going to look at totals. We're potentially going to look at additional charges or add-on costs associated with that vendor invoice and try to match those to add-ons at the PO level. But we're looking at totals for the sum of the invoice, not necessarily at the line level yet. The third thing we'll take a look at is we'll start to look at the PO line items. And in this case, we're going to try to match on the product number. In many cases, the product ID or product code that's on the vendor invoice may not be the same product code that we use that you use in your ERP as your product code that exists on the purchase order that you created to the vendor originally. So in that case, we're taking advantage of the vendor cross-reference table. So we're going to look to see, does a cross-reference exist? We've got some unique capabilities where in this pre-processing phase, if the cross-reference doesn't exist, we can create and store that cross-reference on the fly so that the next time we get the vendor an invoice from the vendor, it'll recognize the cross-reference and identify the product right away without manual intervention. Once we've matched against the products, we're going to start to look at the quantity field. So what's the quantity that we're being invoiced versus the PO or PO receipt quantities? And then we're going to look at the cost. Are we matching on the cost? One of the things that becomes important as we look at multiple layers for matching, not only at the header, but at the PO line level, is we can use one or more of these data elements to identify and determine we have a match. We had a customer who, or I've worked with a distributor in the past who cut a lot of purchase orders that had non-stock products. And of course, those non-stock products don't necessarily have that vendor cross-reference set up. And maybe it's not a product we buy regularly, so we don't want to take the time to create the cross-reference, even though it is a fairly simple process with the Coderis toolset. We can bypass product and start to match against quantity and cost. So that particular distributor said to me, Mike, if the product number doesn't match, but there's a quantity match and a cost match, we can assume for this vendor anyway, that that's a match at the line level and we can move to the next step in the process. And the point here is we are matching that vendor invoice against one or more purchase orders based on a number of different variables. We're looking at header level detail, including totals, subtotals, additional costs that may be added to the invoice. And then we're looking at the line level to identify, does the line match a product, a quantity, a cost that was on the original PO or PO receipt? And do we consider that a match? And we can really define these rules at the vendor level. So certainly there's always a base rule set, right? We want to define the rules and manage exceptions. So we're going to say we want to match on product quantity and cost across the board. But for this particular vendor, we know we have a unique scenario where matching on quantity cost can be considered a hit, and we can move to the next step in the process. So the next thing that we can address, and this is an optional step, but we've seen the majority of our customers take advantage of this, is we can sync that invoice document that came from the vendor, the PDF doc. We can sync that into, if for the Infor customers, the Infor document management solution. Or if you're using another document management solution, we can load that into that electronic filing system and not only load the document in, but create the attributes associated with that document that will make it readily available for your end users, whether they're working in Coderis or working in their ERP with the contextual awareness of the documents associated with the transaction. So very simple process. We've captured the doc in Coderis from the email. We've read that doc to create an electronic file, but we've also uploaded that doc into your document management solution to make it readily available for your customers, no matter where they're working. The next step, and this isn't necessarily a requirement, but it's something that we've seen our customers take advantage of, is to apply the Coderis rules engine to make any adjustments, pre-processing adjustments to the matched invoice, as necessary. So let's talk about some of those rules and what we might be describing here. And these are just a couple of examples. And as we work with our customers through the implementation process and driving full automation with their vendors, we identify these scenarios and we address them as necessary. But this is really that last 10 to 20% we were talking about that maybe the artificial intelligence TextRact tooling or the Coderis Power tooling isn't able to address on first pass. So first example here, we have a customer who gets a discount, a whole order discount when they hit a certain target dollar value. And what they've told us was, Mike, we always make sure we buy to that target dollar value so that we're always getting the whole order discount when we purchase from this particular vendor. In fact, what they did was they assumed that they were going to get the discount and applied it in the ERP to the replacement cost at the product level. So what ends up happening is the purchase order has the discounted cost, but the vendor invoice comes in with the full cost. So as you can imagine, any system is going to struggle to identify that as a match. If I have $1 as my cost on my PO, but the true cost from the vendor is $1.10, the pre-discount cost is $1.10, I'm not going to get a match. It's going to be a discrepancy, and the system's going to want me to reconcile that discrepancy prior to processing the invoice through to accounts payable. So what we were able to do was take that whole discount, that whole order discount that on their vendor invoice appeared below the subtotal. So it was a header level discount. And we were able to apply that and prorate the discount across the line items on the purchase order such that the vendor invoice cost now shows the post-discount amount, which is going to match their ERP purchase order cost. And so historically, they had to go in and manually make those adjustments prior to processing at each individual line, prior to processing the accounts payable record. We can apply this Coderis rules engine to apply that discount across the lines automatically. And again, that happened to be for one vendor, but that same scenario actually has come up with multiple customers across multiple vendors. So we see this, this wasn't a unique scenario, but we addressed it as part of that rules engine and pre-processing prior to posting to the ERP. Some other examples of rules that can be put in place. We can do some auto adjustments based on the vendors, the products, the values, etc. Similar to what I just talked about with the discount, the whole order discount. But for example, if we needed to map to a different division within your organization, we talked about the creation or the simplified creation of the vendor product cross references. If there was line level discounts applied and we needed to set those and adjust the value at the line level, those are the types of things that we can do through that rules engine. Add-ons often can be a challenge. And those are additional charges that the vendor has. It may be freight charge, it may be a pallet charge. And so managing those add-ons, understanding, do they exist on the purchase order and do we need to match them to the PO add-ons? Do they not exist and we need to create those on the vendor invoice? Sometimes the vendor puts those add-on charges as line items on the invoice. Sometimes the vendor puts those add-on charges as dollar values underneath the subtotal at the header level. So we can look at understanding how the vendor communicates those add-ons on their invoices, making sure we recognize those when we read the documents, and then mapping those accordingly so that when we post the payable, again, it's creating those, it's driving full automation and not requiring somebody to intervene and manually make adjustments to the invoice process. Just the last example of something that came from now multiple Coderis customers is how do they apply freight for direct orders or drop ship purchase orders when they're billing their customers. And if we take a step back and think about how most ERPs handle this, the salesperson enters an order for their customer. They don't have the product, so they're going to create a PO to the vendor and have the vendor drop ship the product to the customer. So that's very clean on the sales side. The customer gets their product. The salesperson is able to effectively service the customer and get them what they needed. But now we've got the flip side of the coin, which is when that invoice comes from the vendor, that's not only our trigger to create the accounts payable record, but it's also what drives customer billing for that sales order. So that all typically works very cleanly with these distribution ERP solutions. Where the challenge was for our customers was they were getting billed freight for that drop ship from the vendor. And not only did they want to pass those freight dollars along to their customers when they billed their customers, but they actually wanted to mark up the freight dollars. So in this particular ERP solution, there was a way to very simply pass freight dollars along from the dropship vendor invoice to the customer. But there wasn't a great methodology. In fact, the functionality didn't exist to apply a markup charge or amount to that freight so that they're not only billing the customer for freight, but freight plus 10% or freight plus 20% to drive additional revenue. So we were able to identify, number one, that is a dropship PO. Remember, we're replicating the data from the ERP into Coderis, including the fact that we understand that's a dropship PO. We can then identify what sales order is that direct ship or dropship vendor purchase order tied to, because once again, we've replicated the customer sales order transactions into Coderis. We then look at the rules engine. Okay, is there a freight amount? And do we mark up freight for this vendor when it's a drop ship for this customer? So it's a very specific rules engine. And the reason for that was this particular distributor marked up the freight for their customers differently based on who the customer was and how they did business with them. So in the case of one customer, there was no markup. Fine, nothing to do. In the case of a second customer, there's a 10% markup. So we created a very specific rule to to mark up the freight from the vendor invoice, apply it to the customer sales order transaction. In the third customer example, there was a markup, but it was cost plus 20% on the freight. Same process. We applied the markup and applied it to the customer sales order transaction. Now, when that vendor invoice is finally processed through to your ERP and the accounts payable record is posted, the automated billing of the customer takes place. We are billing the customer for not only the freight from the vendor invoice, but the freight plus any markup that the distributor has decided to apply for that particular customer. So I know these are some pretty specific examples of how we apply that rules engine in the pre-processing stage of this automation. But hopefully that kind of gives you some idea as to how we can not only read the document and post it to accounts payable, but manipulate some of the data in advance to drive greater automation, to remove manual steps in the process, and really remove the accounts payable department from having to manually intervene or reach out to others in their organization prior to posting the accounts payable into the ERP. So at this point, we've read the email, we've read the document, we've created the electronic AP invoice inside of Coderis. We've applied any of these business rules to manipulate or adjust the data prior to posting to the ERP. We then generate the electronic file. And at this point, really, it's mimicking an EDI or electronic data integration transaction set. So we know many distributors will use EDI to drive these communications with their vendors. Sometimes the vendor requires it. In many cases, historically, it was the only option. Now with Coderis AP Automation, obviously you have alternate lower cost options that can drive more efficient automation. But ultimately, once we've created that electronic file and applied those rules, we're generating an XML document just like an EDI transaction would bring in directly from the vendor. So we're using EDI capabilities within the ERP. In this example, Infor Cloud Suite Distribution, and then the ERP or Cloud Suite Distribution will pick up that file and process it through as if it was coming in via an electronic EDI transaction into the AP Invoice Center. So what I'd like to do now is just jump into the live application and walk through some of the different user interface, user experience screens that we've been talking about. So how would this appear in Coderis? How would a user see this data, engage with the data, potentially manually intervene, or be able to go back and identify what processed, what didn't process, and so forth? So once we come in, now we're in the Coderis platform. In the upper left, I can expose the menu of the different modules available to me in the Coderis Operations portal. And you'll see we've got accounts payable here. So if I click into the accounts payable module, I mentioned earlier, we're bringing over the vendors, we're bringing over the purchase orders from your ERP. So we have near real-time data available to us that's just synced from the ERP transactional data. But if we think about the workflow that we just described, really where I'm going to start is at the bottom here, talking about those inbound invoice emails. So here, and I'm going to hide the menu on the left, what I can see is those emails that came in. Remember, we've got the same user experience as we have throughout the Coderis platform. So if there are fields that I want to hide or expose, I can do create saved filters. So if I want to just see the emails that came in based on a date range from a particular vendor assigned to me as a accounts payable person, I can create those filters so it's easy for me to narrow down and just review, in this case, the emails that came in specific to whatever the scenario is I'm trying to address. So not only can I see the emails in the grid view here, but I'm going to see the ability over here to preview the email or actually drill into the email itself. So what I'm seeing is who did it come from? What was the subject of the email? What was the body of the email? When did it come in? But I'm also able to come over here to the internal files and see any documents that were attached to that particular email. Excuse me. So in this case, I can see a PDF document. I can see that it was a vendor invoice file. I can see when it came in. There's additional data elements. So for example, if I wanted to be able to see a status of that particular email, I can add that to the grid view here. But there's a couple of buttons over here to the right. First of all, if I wanted to download that for whatever reason, I could do that. If I wanted to just preview what that document looked like, I can click the little eyeball right there. I can see what is that PDF document that came over from my vendor look like? What are the line items? And we'll see where this can become valuable again in just a few minutes here in other areas of the workflow. The other thing I can see right here is that an invoice was created. And the way I can see, and remember, that's a Coderis only invoice. So we haven't yet processed this through to the ERP, but I can see that an invoice was created. I know that it was created because it's turned green. So that's a visual indicator. If it wasn't able to create an invoice for whatever reason, maybe this email was a survey that came from the vendor to that inbox that didn't have a document, or maybe it wasn't able to read certain data elements enough to the point where it could create a vendor invoice matched to a PO, I would see a different visualization. But here I can see it, and I can actually click on that. And what it'll do is take me from the invoice email screen right into the vendor invoices specific to that particular vendor invoice. When I come in here, you'll see I've got tabs across the top. So I've got a details tab. Think of this as header information coming from combined vendor invoice and the data that we read, along with the purchase order from your ERP that we were able to match to. I can see a vendor code. I can see a vendor name. I can see an invoice date. I can see the terms code. And I'm going to be able to see both the terms that were read from the purchase order, so what terms was on the purchase order, as well as the terms description that was read from the vendor invoice document. So it's a quick visualization of, are my purchase order terms that I assume we get from the vendor matching the terms that were on the vendor invoice? And if not, do I need to make an adjustment? Do I need to reach out to the buyer associated with this vendor to understand if our terms are correct or the vendor's terms? So again, quick visualization of header level detail. I can see things like the status of this particular transaction. I can see, and that could be whether it was received, whether it was processed through to the ERP, whether there was an exception identified. And those are there are some best practice out of the box statuses that are defined, but also definable by the distributor based on their workflow throughout this process. I can see if there were any additional charges. Remember, we talked about freight or pallet charges, things like that, associated with either the purchase order or read from the vendor invoice. So this essentially, again, what we're reviewing here is header level detail that was read from the vendor invoice document, but also potentially coming from or matched against the your ERP purchase order. In addition, I can see line items. So I can see the items that were read from the vendor invoice. I can see the quantities. I can see the costs. I can see extended price. I can see unit of measure. And again, what we're looking to do is identify, is there a match? If there is a match, we should be able to process this through successfully. If there's no match, it can create an exception that somebody either needs to review or there needs to be a Coderis business rule applied or auto applied to this process before we post to the ERP. So again, header and line level detail. There are some other tabs up here. Once again, I can see the internal files tab. there's the document. So that document was not only associated with that inbound email view that we looked at a minute ago, but it's also now attached to the electronic AP invoice that got created. I can view that document again, I can download, but here's another capability where I can actually pull that up in a split screen view. Because many times what I want to be able to do is review if there are updates or changes or validation that needs to occur manually. I want to be able to review the document itself as I'm identifying the detailed information that's in the electronic AP invoice file we created in Coderis. So it gives me the ability to very quickly navigate through header level detail, item level detail, make any adjustments to that information as necessary. If there needs to be manual intervention prior to processing through to the ERP. The final step in this process, and by the way, we could have automatically, I don't have it turned on, but we can automatically upload and tie that into the document management systems we talked about earlier. So for Infor customers, that would be Infor document management. I can also choose to manually upload that if we don't have the automation turned on. But then finally, I can go ahead and I can release this to the ERP. Once everything is clean, I know we're ready to go. Now, when we think about implementation and steps from a manual process for our customers through to a fully automated process, many times what they'll do is they'll make decisions at the vendor level as to when they want to go from, I would like to manually review the information in Coderis prior to posting to or releasing to the ERP, to it doesn't matter, I know we're clean, the documents are being read accurately, the business rules are being applied accurately. We can then go into the vendor, and I'll show that in just 1 second, and determine that we want to automate the delivery of the Coderis AP invoice into your ERP for processing through to accounts payable. There's a couple of other options here. One of them is I may want to quickly email a copy of this vendor invoice to the buyer associated with that, so that we can ask a question: is the cost right? Is the terms code correct? Prior to posting. Many times the accounts payable department will be looking for discrepancies, but they need to rely on the purchasing department and those buyers to validate whether that discrepancy is accurate, whether the vendor was correct, we were correct, whether we need to update information or question the vendor prior to posting the invoice. So there are other options or opportunities here. The other thing we can do is when I'm looking at a particular invoice, if for whatever reason the AP vendor was identified incorrectly, we have an opportunity to switch the vendor record prior to posting to the ERP and processing the payable. Perhaps this is more common when we talk about expense vendors or add-on vendors than it is on trade or inventory vendors. But again, some flexibility from user experience perspective to be able to manipulate the information prior to posting it if we haven't moved to that fully automated process at the vendor level. So there's one other thing I want to just call out here. We brought those vendors over into Coderis, and when we look at the vendor records themselves, we've got a bunch of the information that's being populated from the ERP. So the name, the address, the terms codes, the default terms codes, and so forth. But what we also have is we have a section down here called automation. So are we using custom rules? Do we want to, and here I talked about at the vendor level, the opportunity to automatically turn on the release to ERP once those are processed through Coderis. So this allows for a gradual implementation at the vendor level to turn on full automation. It enables our customers to have confidence in the ability of the automations tooling to read the documents, to match prior to saying, yes, I want to automate that process fully. And our goal here really is full automation, full matching, minimize discrepancies, minimize user intervention in this process. So you can see we've got some different options we can enable when we look at the vendor level in determining how do we want to implement automation for each individual vendor. So that's really what I wanted to talk to everybody about today. As we think about the next steps, we'd be definitely interested in having one-on-one conversations with you so that you can better understand the implementation process, so that we can talk about the steps to start moving towards automation. We can talk about the timeline to get you from a manual or partially automated solution to a fully automated solution leveraging the Coderis platform. In terms of next steps, if you're not an existing Coderis customer, you can go to coderis.com, and you have the ability there to reach out to us and request that we contact you and initiate a conversation. If you are an existing Coderis customer, certainly feel free to reach out to me as necessary, but you can also have a conversation with your account rep, your account manager, and start the conversation on next steps. Look forward to talking to you in the future.